In a small southern town in the early 2000s, Sheriff Matthew Grayson was a respected lawman and a loving family man, or so it seemed. But beneath the polished badge and his perfect family lay a dark secret, an affair with a 19-year-old girl that would lead to scandal, betrayal, and ultimately murder. Today, we uncover the story of how a trusted figure's forbidden relationship unraveled a community and ended in tragedy. In the quiet town of Magnolia, Georgia, August 2008, life seemed simple and predictable. At its heart stood Sheriff Matthew Grayson, a man both respected and revered. At 45, Matthew was a picture of authority. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a calm voice that could soothe even the most restless disputes. He wore his badge with pride, patrolling the same streets he had grown up on. Magnolia trusted him, not just as their sheriff, but as the moral compass of their tight-knit community. But beneath this facade of control lay a man burdened by invisible cracks. Matthew had been married to Eleanor for over 2 decades. Eleanor, 42, was an elegant woman with an unwavering gaze and a stern voice. She had supported Matthew through every twist and turn of his career, managing their home with an iron grip while raising their 2 sons, Tyler, 17, and Ben, 15. The Grayson home, a 2-story house shaded by ancient oak trees, was the town's ideal of stability. Yet behind its closed doors, Eleanor carried the weariness of a woman who had given her all to a man who no longer looked at her the way he used to. Matthew felt it too, though he never said it aloud. The routines of their life, once comforting, had grown into chains. He felt suffocated, lost in the shadow of his own image. The perfect sheriff, the devoted husband, the admirable father. It was this inner turmoil, this quiet yearning for something unspoken, that led him to Sarah Cole. Sarah was a 19-year-old waitress at the Magnolia Cafe, a small diner nestled by the edge of town. She was a striking girl, with pale skin that seemed to glow under the dim lights of the diner, and long auburn hair that framed her soft face. But her beauty was overshadowed by the weight of her struggles. Sarah had grown up in a strict household, under the unforgiving eyes of her father, a preacher, and her mother, a woman who believed obedience was the only virtue a girl needed. Sarah's world had been one of rules, sermons, and whispered threats of hellfire. By July 2008, Sarah had broken free from her parents' grasp, but freedom came at a cost. She rented a tiny room above the cafe, where peeling wallpaper and the constant hum of an air conditioner kept her company. She worked long shifts to make ends meet, often staying late to avoid the solitude of her room. It was during these late hours that she met Sheriff Grayson. At first, their interactions were harmless. Sarah would pour him a cup of coffee as he worked on case files, and he would ask her about her day. But there was something in her eyes, a mix of vulnerability and defiance, that pulled Matthew in. He saw in her a reflection of his own longing, his own frustration. Their conversations grew longer, dipping into personal territory. Sarah opened up about her estrangement from her parents. her dreams of leaving Magnolia, and her fears of being stuck in a life she didn't want. Matthew felt a strange protectiveness toward her, a need to shield her from the world's harshness. And Sarah, in turn, saw him as a savior, a man who could offer her the stability she had never known. By August, the lines between duty and desire blurred. What began as late-night conversations in the dim light of the diner spilled into secretive encounters under the cover of darkness. Their affair began on a humid night in mid-August 2008, when the air was thick with the scent of rain. Sarah had closed the diner late, and Matthew had offered her a ride home. That night marked the beginning of their forbidden relationship. They would meet in secluded spots, the edge of the woods near the riverbank, the abandoned barn outside town, even the back seat of Matthew's patrol car. Each meeting was charged with an electric tension, a mix of guilt and exhilaration. Matthew became consumed by her, sneaking glances at her whenever he stopped by the diner, and inventing excuses to patrol near her apartment. Sarah, too, was swept up in the thrill of it all. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, desired, and loved, or so she thought. By October 2008, Sarah began to feel the early signs of pregnancy. She was nauseous in the mornings, her appetite changed, and her body felt foreign to her. The realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. She kept it to herself at first, terrified of what Matthew might say, but her fear grew too heavy to bear. On a chilly evening in November, she confided in him. They met in his patrol car, parked in a shadowy corner of the old Magnolia Mill lot. As the words left her lips, Matthew's face turned pale. Panic gripped him. The thought of his secret life being exposed, of losing his family, his career, and the respect of the town was unbearable. He begged Sarah to keep the pregnancy hidden, promising to support her in secret. But the truth had a way of slipping through the cracks. Word reached Sarah's parents by December 2008. Their anger was swift and merciless. They accused her of bringing shame upon their family, branding her a sinner. That night, they threw her out of their home, her belongings stuffed into black trash bags that they dumped onto the front lawn. Sarah stood in the cold, clutching her stomach, her tears freezing on her cheeks. When Matthew found out, the weight of guilt nearly crushed him. He could no longer keep the secret. On a rainy evening in early January 2009, he confessed everything to Eleanor. She listened in silence as he unraveled the truth, her face betraying no emotion. Inside, she felt a storm of rage, betrayal, and humiliation. But Eleanor was a proud woman, and the thought of the town whispering about her husband's infidelity was more than she could bear. After hours of tense silence, Eleanor made her decision. Sarah would come to their home, but only under strict conditions. It wasn't forgiveness, it was survival. That same night, under the cloak of darkness, Matthew drove to Sarah's apartment. He found her sitting on the floor, surrounded by the remnants of her life. Without a word, she climbed into the passenger seat. The ride to the Grayson home was silent, the tension suffocating. By the time they arrived, the house was shrouded in shadows. Eleanor stood by the door, her face unreadable. As Sarah crossed the threshold, she felt the chill of the house seep into her bones. This was no sanctuary. This was the beginning of something far darker than she could have imagined. And so, in the dead of night on January 9th, 2009, Sarah Cole became an invisible resident of the Grayson household, a secret hidden within the walls of a home that had already begun to crumble. By January 2009, Sarah Cole had settled into the Grayson household, but the sense of unease was palpable. Eleanor's decision to allow Sarah into her home was less an act of mercy and more a desperate move to control the narrative. To Eleanor, appearances were everything. If the town ever discovered the truth, it would destroy the life she had painstakingly built. But having Sarah under her roof felt like housing a serpent, and Eleanor could never let her guard down. Sarah, for her part, quickly made her presence felt. At first, she tried to blend in, keeping to the guest room and speaking in hushed tones. But as the days passed, her true nature began to show. Pregnancy amplified her moods, swinging her between vulnerability and defiance. She started wandering through the house uninvited, appearing in the kitchen during family breakfasts, or lounging on the couch as though she belonged. Her sense of entitlement grated on Eleanor, who saw these actions as a direct challenge to her authority. The boys, Tyler and Ben, sensed the tension, but were kept in the dark about Sarah's true situation. Eleanor explained her presence as a favor to a young woman in need, though the vague explanation left them suspicious. Tyler, who was nearing adulthood, noticed how Sarah's gaze lingered on their father, and how Matthew became visibly uncomfortable whenever she was near. Ben, the quieter of the two, found Sarah unnerving. Her sudden outbursts and sharp remarks left him uneasy. By early February 2009, the household felt like a pressure cooker. Sarah's erratic behavior escalated. She would laugh loudly at inappropriate moments, make cutting remarks about Eleanor's cooking, or linger too long in Matthew's study. Eleanor began avoiding her altogether, retreating to her bedroom for long hours. Matthew, caught between the two women, felt his life spiraling out of control. He couldn't reconcile his role as a protector of the town with the chaos inside his home. The tipping point came one night in mid-February 2009. Sarah had made herself comfortable at the dining table while the family ate. Uninvited, she began commenting on Eleanor's parenting, questioning why the boys seemed so repressed. Her words, casual and biting, were like a knife to Eleanor's pride. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Matthew avoided Eleanor's gaze, his guilt practically radiating from him. The boys excused themselves quickly, sensing the storm brewing. That night, Eleanor wept quietly in their bedroom, her tears a mixture of rage and despair. Sarah's growing isolation fueled her need for attention. Feeling shunned by the Graysons and burdened by the weight of her pregnancy, she reached out to the only people who would listen, her old friends. These were people who shared her reckless streak, the kind who thrived on gossip and chaos. At first, she simply complained about her living situation, speaking vaguely of Eleanor's coldness and Matthew's hypocrisy. But the more she drank at their gatherings, the looser her tongue became. On the night of February 21st, 2009, at a party held in the woods just outside town, Sarah let slip the truth. Fueled by alcohol and resentment, she revealed that Sheriff Grayson was the father of her child. Her voice, slurred but defiant, carried over the crackling of the bonfire. Her friends were stunned, but the initial shock quickly gave way to excitement. In Magnolia, scandal was currency, and Sarah had just dropped a bombshell. By February 24th, 2009, the whispers had spread like wildfire. The town, once so reverent of Matthew Grayson, began to buzz with speculation. Clerks at the grocery store exchanged knowing glances, churchgoers muttered during Sunday service, and deputies at the station grew awkward around their boss. The once pristine image of the sheriff was tarnished, and Eleanor could feel the weight of the judgment every time she stepped out of the house. For Eleanor, the public humiliation was unbearable. She had sacrificed her pride to protect the family's reputation, only for Sarah to destroy it in a moment of drunken recklessness. On the evening of the February 26th, 2009, she packed a small suitcase and left. She drove through the night to Atlanta, where her sister lived in a modest bungalow. It was a place where Eleanor could be away from the stares and whispers, where she could lick her wounds in private. Matthew was devastated. He had always seen Eleanor as his anchor, the person who steadied him even when he didn't deserve it. Without her, the house felt hollow. Sarah, emboldened by Eleanor's absence, began acting as though she was now the mistress of the house. She redecorated the guest room, brought home items without asking, and even rearranged furniture. For Matthew, every day felt like an open wound, the guilt of his actions eating away at him. By the March 1st, 2009, Matthew publicly denied the rumors, speaking to reporters outside the sheriff's office. He called the claims baseless gossip and implored the town to respect his family's privacy. But his words did little to quell the storm. Privately, he called Eleanor every evening, his voice breaking as he begged her to come home. Eleanor, ever pragmatic, agreed after several days, not because she forgave him, but because she couldn't bear to see the boys suffer. Her sons needed their mother, and she wouldn't abandon them. On March 5th, 2009, Eleanor returned to Magnolia. Her car pulled into the driveway late that evening, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The boys greeted her with relief, though they knew better than to ask questions. Matthew helped her unpack, his hands trembling as he carried her bags inside. Eleanor said little, her face a mask of quiet resolve. The household, now reunited, settled into an uneasy routine. Eleanor avoided Sarah whenever possible, keeping her interactions limited to icy formalities. Matthew, desperate to make amends, tried to bridge the widening gap between the two women, but his efforts only deepened the resentment. Sarah, sensing the shift in power, began plotting ways to assert her control, her mind spinning with dark possibilities. The fragile peace in the Grayson household was nothing more than a veneer, waiting for the slightest touch to shatter it completely. By the March 3rd, 2009, tension in the Grayson household had reached its breaking point. Sarah, now 7 months pregnant, felt like an outsider in a house where no one wanted her. She saw Eleanor's return as a direct challenge to her place in Matthew's life. Sarah's jealousy festered, feeding dark thoughts that began as fleeting ideas, but soon solidified into a dangerous plan. Eleanor, despite her best efforts, had failed to conceal her disdain. Her clipped words and pointed glances were daggers to Sarah's fragile ego. Sarah grew obsessed with eliminating Eleanor. If she could just remove her rival, she believed everything would fall into place. She envisioned herself as the rightful head of the household, with Matthew and her unborn child by her side. Her desperation twisted into a warped resolve. On the evening of March 4th, 2009, as the family sat in their usual strained silence during dinner, Sarah excused herself early, retreating to the kitchen with a sinister purpose. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the floorboards. Sarah carefully opened the pantry, her trembling hands searching until they found a box of rat poison tucked behind canned goods. The green powder seemed innocuous, almost harmless, in its simple packaging. She moved methodically, her mind void of second thoughts, as she sprinkled the poison into Eleanor's tea. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she placed the cup on the table, her face a mask of feigned indifference. But Eleanor was not easily fooled. She had been watching Sarah closely for weeks, noticing every odd behavior and every furtive glance. As she reached for the cup, her instincts screamed at her. Something wasn't right. She hesitated, her sharp eyes darting to Sarah, whose forced calm betrayed her guilt. A silent standoff ensued, broken only when Eleanor rose abruptly, the cup in hand, and stormed into the kitchen. The confrontation was swift and explosive. Eleanor demanded answers, her voice cutting through the stillness of the house. Sarah's facade crumbled, and the air thickened with the weight of accusations and denials. Matthew, hearing the commotion from his study, rushed into the kitchen to find the two women locked in a heated exchange. Eleanor, her face pale with fury, thrust the teacup toward Sarah, demanding to know what she had done. Sarah, now cornered, snapped. Her emotions boiled over into rage, and she grabbed the nearest object, a kitchen knife. The next moments unfolded in a blur of chaos. Sarah lunged, the blade flashing in the dim light. Eleanor instinctively stepped back, her arm raised in defense, but the knife caught her just below the collarbone. She staggered, her hand clutching the wound as blood seeped through her fingers. Matthew yelled, his voice desperate, as he moved to restrain Sarah, who was trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and horror. Matthew wrestled Sarah to the ground, pinning her arms as she thrashed beneath him. Her screams filled the kitchen, raw and animalistic, as if she were fighting not just him, but the crushing weight of her own actions. Blood pooled on the tile floor, a stark contrast to the pristine white cabinets. Eleanor, pale and gasping, leaned against the counter, her strength waning with every passing second. As sirens wailed in the distance, summoned by Matthew's frantic call to 911, Sarah's fight began to fade. She lay still, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with fear. The reality of what she had done loomed over her like a dark cloud, and she knew there was no way out. The paramedics arrived in a flurry of motion, tending to Eleanor first. Matthew watched helplessly as they loaded his wife onto a stretcher, her life hanging by a thread. In the chaos, Sarah's eyes fell on the teacup, still sitting on the counter. A grotesque calm washed over her as she realized her fate. She would be vilified, imprisoned, and forever shunned. At that moment, she made her choice. With shaking hands, Sarah grabbed the cup and drank its contents in one swift motion. The poison burned her throat, its bitterness a fitting punishment for the bitterness in her heart. The paramedics, distracted by Eleanor's condition, turned too late to stop her. By the time they reached her, Sarah was convulsing on the floor, her body rejecting the toxin that would ultimately claim her life. The morning after the fatal night, the Grayson home was sealed off as a crime scene. The once warm and lively house now felt cold and empty, its walls echoing with the weight of what had transpired. Detectives combed through every inch of the kitchen, documenting the bloodstains, the knife, and the poisoned teacup. Matthew, still in shock, gave his statement to the police. His voice was flat and mechanical as he recounted the events, his eyes hollow with guilt. Eleanor, recovering in the hospital, was also interviewed. She spoke haltingly, her voice weak but steady, describing Sarah's erratic behavior and the events leading up to the attack. Toxicology reports confirmed the presence of rat poison in Sarah's system, solidifying the narrative that she had acted out of jealousy and despair. News of the incident spread quickly, dividing the community. Some sympathized with Sarah, seeing her as a young woman manipulated by a man in power. Others vilified her, blaming her for her own demise and for nearly destroying the Grayson family. Whispers filled the pews at church services, and neighbors exchanged speculative glances over picket fences. Eleanor, though physically recovering, found herself at the center of the town's scrutiny. Some admired her resilience, while others questioned her decision to allow Sarah into their home. Matthew, once the town's pillar of integrity, became a pariah. His resignation on March 10th, 2009, was met with a mixture of relief and disappointment. By the March 20th, 2009, the investigation concluded. The evidence absolved Matthew and Eleanor of any direct wrongdoing, framing Sarah's actions as the desperate choices of a troubled young woman. But the damage was done. Matthew, now unemployed and disgraced, retreated into solitude, spending his days repairing the house as if physical labor could mend the fractures in his life. Eleanor, despite considering divorce, chose to stay. It was not out of love, but necessity. She believed in rebuilding, even if the foundation was irreparably cracked. Together, they began the slow, painful process of reclaiming what remained of their family. The Grayson home, once a symbol of stability, now stood as a reminder of betrayal, tragedy, and the thin line between order and chaos. The town of Magnolia, though moving forward, would never forget the night its sheriff's house became a battlefield. Years later, the Grayson family still bore the scars of the scandal. Matthew, once a pillar of the community, lived a quiet life as a consultant. Eleanor, while distant from her husband, focused on charity work. The town of Magnolia, meanwhile, used the tragedy as a cautionary tale about power, secrecy, and the consequences of betrayal. Sarah Cole's short life and tragic end became a dark chapter in the town's history, a reminder of how even the most respected figures can harbor devastating secrets. What leads people to betray those closest to them? What drives someone to the brink of obsession and violence? Stories like this remind us that even in the quietest corners, darkness lurks just beneath the surface. We have a very similar case to this. The case where a father-in-law's affair with son's young wife, and it ends in pregnancy and suicide. Make sure to check it out.